What defines a good person? More importantly, what defines you? These questions have haunted philosophy for centuries, but two thinkers offered answers so opposite they still shape how we see ourselves today. One believed humans are naturally violent, selfish machines, driven by fear and the hunger for power. The other argued, we're born innocent and compassionate, corrupted only by the societies we build. Tonight, as consciousness fades and sleep approaches, we'll explore this fundamental divide through voices separated by a century but locked in eternal debate. The stakes here aren't academic. Your view of human nature determines everything: how you raise your children, whether you trust your neighbors, what kind of government you believe we need. One philosopher's answer leads to surveillance and control. The other's leads to revolution and reform. Both can't be right, yet both shaped the modern world. Thomas Hobbes speaks first, his voice carrying the weight of a man who witnessed civil war tear his country apart during the 1640s. Living through England's bloodiest conflict fundamentally shaped what he believed about humanity. When order collapsed and neighbor turned against neighbor, Hobbes saw something he could never unsee. Hobbes says, "Let me begin with a simple observation that most prefer to ignore. Remove the laws, the police, the courts, and the fear of punishment, and watch what happens to your civilized society. I have witnessed this myself. During the wars that ravaged my homeland, I saw men who were once peaceful merchants become looters. I saw neighbors who once shared meals accuse each other of treason. The veneer of civilization proved thinner than anyone imagined. This isn't pessimism, it's realism, born from observation. Human beings are machines, driven by internal motions we call desires and aversions. We move toward pleasure and away from pain. Everything else, all the noble words about virtue and goodness, merely decorates this fundamental truth. When I met Galileo in Italy, I understood something profound. Just as objects in motion stay in motion unless stopped by external force, humans in pursuit of their interests continue that pursuit unless stopped by external power. Hobbes continues, "Consider the equality that exists among us. Not the pleasant equality philosophers celebrate, but the dark equality that makes civilization necessary. The strongest man must sleep. The wisest can be outwitted by fools working together. Every human being possesses the capacity to kill any other through strength, cunning, or alliance. This creates what I call the natural condition of mankind, a state where no authority exists to keep us in check. In this natural state, you have the right to everything. Anything you believe necessary for your preservation, you may take. Your neighbor's food, their shelter, their life, if it threatens yours. They possess the same right. The result? Perpetual war. Not necessarily constant fighting, but the constant readiness to fight. The permanent threat hanging over every interaction. Life becomes solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. You think I exaggerate? Look at how nations behave toward each other even today, where no higher authority constrains them. They maintain armies, build weapons, spy on each other, prepare constantly for conflict. This is the state of nature playing out on a larger stage. Without government, individuals live the same way. Every person a nation unto themselves. Every interaction a potential battlefield. Hobbes says, the cause of this condition lies in three fundamental aspects of human nature. First, competition. We all want the same things: safety, resources, comfort, power. But these things are limited. When two people desire the same thing they cannot both possess, they become enemies. Second, diffidence, which is my term for the deep distrust we feel toward others. You cannot know your neighbor's intentions. They smile, but do they plot? This uncertainty breeds preemptive strikes. Better to attack first than wait to be attacked. Third, glory. We crave recognition, status, reputation. An insult to our honor demands response. These three causes ensure conflict erupts constantly in the state of nature. Some protest that I describe civilized people and simply imagine them without civilization. They claim natural humans would be different, gentler, more innocent. This mistakes the issue entirely. Human nature doesn't change whether we live in cities or forests. The passions remain constant. What changes is whether external power constrains those passions. The savage living alone in the wilderness faces the same drives towards self-preservation and power. He simply has fewer competitors nearby. Here's what troubles the comfortable philosophers most. In the state of nature, no such thing as justice exists. Right and wrong have no meaning. Where no common power establishes law, no law exists to violate. Where no law exists, no injustice is possible. The words become empty. You may find this shocking, but ask yourself, what makes theft wrong? Only that law prohibits it and punishment follows. Remove the law, and taking what you need for survival becomes simple necessity, not crime. Hobbes continues, morality itself is a human invention, necessary for social cooperation, but grounded in nothing more than mutual agreement. We are not moved by abstract ideals, but by very concrete fears. Fear of death primarily. Fear of violent death at the hands of others. This fear, this most powerful of passions, finally motivates us toward peace, not love, not compassion, not divine command. Fear. From this fear emerges what I call the social contract. Rational calculation reveals a solution to the state of nature. If everyone agrees to surrender their natural right to everything, if everyone agrees to obey a common power, then security becomes possible. We trade freedom for safety. We accept limits on our actions in exchange for limits on others' actions toward us. But here's the crucial part that softer thinkers miss. This contract requires enforcement. Words and agreements mean nothing without the sword to back them. Covenants without power are but words, with no strength to secure anyone. The social contract doesn't work through mutual trust or goodwill. It works through fear of the sovereign power we create together. This power, this Leviathan as I named it, must be absolute. It must possess enough force to terrify everyone into obedience. Only then does civilization become possible. You cannot divide this power or limit it significantly without returning toward the state of nature. The sovereign must be judge of what doctrines are taught, what opinions expressed, what actions permitted. This sounds tyrannical to modern ears, but consider the alternative. Civil war, chaos, the return of universal fear. I watched my country tear itself apart over questions of divided sovereignty, over who held ultimate authority. The answer must be clear. One power, absolute and undivided. Hobbes says, this doesn't mean the sovereign should be cruel or arbitrary. A wise sovereign understands that preservation of subjects serves their own interest. Dead or impoverished subjects provide no benefit. But the sovereign's power cannot be challenged or limited by those below. No right of rebellion exists, because rebellion returns us to the state of war we contracted to escape. The sovereign may do wrong, even great wrong, but even this remains preferable to the universal wrong of the state of nature. My critics call this view dark or cynical. They prefer to believe in natural human goodness, in our capacity for spontaneous cooperation and mutual care. They point to friendship, love, sacrifice. I don't deny these exist, but I question their foundation. The mother who protects her child acts from the same self-interest as the thief who steals. She preserves what she values, what brings her pleasure, and serves her sense of identity. Strip away the pretty names, and you find the same mechanical operations. Desire and aversion, pleasure and pain. Power is what we truly seek, whether we admit it or not. Not necessarily political power or dominion over others, though some pursue these openly. But power in its fundamental sense, the ability to secure future goods, to protect ourselves from future harms. Even when we appear to rest content, we scheme for more security, more control over our circumstances. This restless desire for power after power continues until death. It's not corruption or vice. It's the basic operation of the human machine, seeking to preserve itself in an uncertain world. A voice interrupts, carrying a different tone entirely. Where Hobbes sees machines, this voice hears possibility. Where Hobbes finds darkness, this voice insists on light. Rousseau says, "My friend speaks with the confidence of someone who has mistaken the disease for the natural state of health." He looks at civilized humans, corrupted by centuries of social development, and declares this corruption to be our original nature. But he has it exactly backwards. What Hobbes describes isn't human nature. It's what society has made of human nature. Before we continue with Rousseau's challenge, understand what's at stake in this disagreement. If Hobbes is right, then strong government, strict laws, and constant surveillance are necessary evils. We're dangerous animals requiring cages, however comfortable we make them. But if Rousseau is right, then our institutions themselves create the problems they claim to solve. The answer isn't more control but less corruption. Not stronger chains but better societies that allow our natural goodness to flourish. This debate isn't historical curiosity. It's the fundamental question that determines everything else. And Rousseau is about to dismantle Hobbes's entire worldview, piece by piece, showing how the English philosopher projected society's failures backward onto nature itself. Rousseau says, "Let me be clear about what Hobbes has done. He's taken people shaped by centuries of civilization, corrupted by property and status and artificial needs, and called this human nature. It's like studying fish in a polluted river and concluding that fish naturally carry toxins. The toxins came from outside. The corruption isn't original. When Hobbes describes his state of nature, he fills it with concepts that could only exist in society. Competition for glory? That requires social comparison. Distrust of others? That assumes complex interactions and memory of betrayal. Restless desire for power after power? That's the sickness of civilized man, not natural man. The savage wandering the forest doesn't scheme about future security. He eats when hungry, sleeps when tired, lives entirely in the present moment." Rousseau continues, "Natural man possesses two fundamental sentiments that Hobbes completely ignores. The first is amour de soi, self-love in its pure form. This isn't Hobbes's endless grasping for power. It's simple self-preservation, the quiet instinct to maintain one's existence without comparing oneself to others or seeking dominance. The deer doesn't want to be the most powerful deer. It wants to survive, to eat, to avoid predators. Natural man operates the same way. But here's what Hobbes truly missed. The second sentiment, pitié, compassion. The instinctive repugnance at seeing another suffer. Watch how even animals hesitate to harm their own kind unnecessarily. A wolf may kill for food, but it doesn't torture. A mother of any species will protect not just her own offspring, but sometimes even the young of others. This isn't calculation. It's not mechanical self-interest. It's genuine feeling, present before society taught us to rationalize and compare and compete. Hobbes responds, "Pretty sentiments, but let's examine what actually happens when you place humans together without law. You speak of natural compassion, yet history provides no examples of humans living peacefully without governance. Every time civil authority collapses, what emerges? Precisely the war of all against all that I described. The English Civil War, the chaos of revolution, the breakdown of order anywhere, anytime. This isn't theory, it's observation. Your natural man is a fantasy. This solitary savage wandering forests, living in the present, feeling compassion for others he rarely encounters. How did such creatures ever form societies at all? If they were so content in isolation, so free of desire for more, why did they ever come together? Your own theory contradicts itself. You must explain the transition from this supposed Eden to civilization, and every explanation you offer reveals that the seeds of corruption were there from the beginning. Rousseau responds, but I do explain the transition, and it proves my point, not yours. Natural man lived scattered, encountering others rarely. When he did, there was no reason for conflict. Resources were abundant relative to simple needs. No property existed to fight over, no status to compete for, no long-term projects requiring cooperation that could break down into betrayal. Then something changed. Humans began to settle, to live as neighbors, to form what I call nascent societies. And here's where the trouble started, but notice, it started from circumstances, not from nature. Living together, humans began to compare. One person sang better, another ran faster. These differences meant nothing in isolation, but in groups they became the basis for judgment. For the first time, humans cared what others thought of them. This created amour propre, vanity, self-love based on comparison rather than simple self-preservation. This is the corruption Hobbes mistakes for nature. It's what society created. The savage who once needed only to satisfy his own wants now needs to be admired, to be thought superior, to maintain reputation. Everything Hobbes describes as natural, competition, glory-seeking, distrust, flows from this social creation. Hobbes says, but this still proves my point. Once any humans live together, my description becomes accurate. You're arguing about some prehistoric phase that, even by your admission, humanity left behind the moment we formed groups. So for all practical purposes, for any time relevant to political philosophy, humans are exactly as I described them. Your natural man is irrelevant because he cannot exist in any actual society. The moment two families live as neighbors, you admit corruption begins. The moment property exists, conflict follows. So whether this corruption is natural or social matters not at all. It's universal in any context where political philosophy applies. You've described an impossible ideal that teaches us nothing about how to govern real humans in real circumstances. Rousseau responds, it matters enormously, because if corruption comes from society, then better society can reduce corruption. Your solution is to chain the beast, accepting that humans are fundamentally savage and building stronger cages. My solution is to remove the conditions that made us savage in the first place, not by returning to forests, which is impossible and undesirable, but by creating social arrangements that don't corrupt our natural sentiments. The key is understanding what went wrong. The introduction of private property marked the crucial turning point. The first man who fenced off land and declared it his, who found others naive enough to accept this claim, that man founded civil society and all its miseries. Property created inequality. Some accumulated more than others. Those with less became dependent on those with more. Suddenly, self-preservation required not just finding food, but navigating social hierarchies, pleasing property owners, competing for resources that were now artificially scarce because some claimed exclusive ownership. Hobbes responds, so you blame property for all human vice. Yet property emerges naturally from human labor and the desire to secure one's future. The farmer who plants seeds wants to harvest the crop, not have it taken by those who did no work. The builder wants to inhabit the house, not see it occupied by others. Property rights protect the fruits of labor. Without them, why would anyone work harder than absolutely necessary for immediate survival? Your solution to inequality is what, exactly? Abolish property entirely? Return to primitive poverty where everyone is equally miserable? Or create some system where the collective decides all distribution? And who controls this collective? You've simply moved the problem. Instead of individuals pursuing their interests, you have groups pursuing collective interests, with all the same conflicts emerging at a different level. Rousseau says, you're missing the distinction I'm drawing. There's a difference between possessing what you use and claiming ownership of what you don't. The farmer who works land, lives on it, grows food for his family. This isn't the problem. The problem is the landlord who owns vast territories worked by others, who extracts rent not from his labor, but from his claim. The artisan who makes tools and keeps them isn't the issue. The merchant who hoards resources to create artificial scarcity and inflate prices, that's the corruption. Natural inequality, differences in strength or intelligence, these are minor and manageable. Social inequality, where institutions enforce vast disparities in power and wealth, this creates the desperate competition Hobbes describes. Remove the artificial scarcity, the enforced hierarchies, the systems that concentrate power, and you remove the conditions that make humans behave as Hobbes claims they naturally behave. Hobbes responds, even if I granted that property causes inequality, which I don't fully, you still haven't solved the fundamental problem. Humans desire more than subsistence. We want comfort, beauty, leisure, knowledge. Achieving these requires cooperation on scales impossible without property rights, division of labor, and hierarchy. Your critique of landlords and merchants ignores that these institutions enable the surplus production that makes civilization possible. You romanticize primitive simplicity, but would you actually choose to live that way? Without medicine, without books, without art, without any of the achievements that make human life more than mere survival. All of this requires the social structures you condemn. The inequality you lament is the price we pay for everything that makes life worth living beyond animal existence. Rousseau responds, now you're the one creating false choices. I'm not advocating primitive poverty. I'm arguing for social arrangements that preserve what's valuable about civilization while eliminating what corrupts. This requires understanding what humans actually need versus what society has taught them to want. Natural man needed little and was content. Civilized man needs everything and is never satisfied. The solution isn't returning to forests. It's creating societies that don't generate infinite artificial needs. True freedom doesn't come from isolation, but from political communities organized around the general will, where each person participates in collective self-governance. Not the surrender to absolute sovereigns that you advocate, but genuine democracy where laws express the common good rather than particular interests. When people make laws for themselves collectively, they remain free even while obeying because they obey only their own collective judgment. Hobbes says, and here we reach the practical test. Your general will sound appealing until you ask how it operates in practice. Who determines what the general will actually is? How do you distinguish genuine common good from factional interest? What happens when citizens disagree about what serves the collective? Your democracy either becomes majority tyranny or it collapses into the very chaos I describe. You've provided no mechanism for resolving conflicts except appealing to an abstract collective will that different groups will interpret differently. My sovereign may be absolute, but at least the authority is clear and unified. Your general will fractures into competing claims about what the people really want, with each faction certain they represent the true common good. This doesn't avoid conflict. It multiplies it by giving everyone a supposed right to determine collective direction. The debate has reached its critical juncture. Hobbes insists that only absolute authority can prevent social collapse. Rousseau maintains that corruption flows from bad institutions, not human nature. One sees darkness requiring chains, the other sees light dimmed by circumstance, and both claim their view protects human welfare, while the other path leads to misery. But there's a deeper question neither has fully addressed. What about the evidence from nature itself? From how humans actually lived before civilization, from what science can tell us about our evolutionary past? Rousseau says, you demand evidence from nature itself. Then let's examine what we actually find. Look at indigenous peoples who lived with minimal property and hierarchy. Were they locked in perpetual warfare, as your theory predicts? Most anthropological evidence suggests the opposite. Hunter-gatherer societies showed remarkable cooperation, shared resources freely, and resolved disputes through discussion rather than violence. These weren't utopias, but neither were they the bloodbaths you describe. Hobbes responds. Selective examples prove nothing. For every peaceful tribe you cite, I can show you evidence of prehistoric violence. Skeletal remains reveal traumatic injuries from weapons. Archaeological sites show fortifications and mass graves. Some estimates suggest 15% of deaths in prehistoric societies resulted from violence, far higher than modern rates. Your peaceful savages are myths created by those who never faced genuine scarcity or tribal competition. Rousseau says, but you're conflating different stages of development. The violence you describe increased with population density, territorial claims, and accumulated resources worth fighting over. Precisely the conditions I identify as corrupting. Early humans living in small mobile groups with minimal possessions had little reason for systematic violence. They could simply move away from conflicts. It's when humans became sedentary, developed agriculture, and created property that violence intensified. Hobbes responds, movement itself requires territory. Resources exist in finite locations. Even mobile groups must defend hunting grounds, water sources, and safe shelters. Your narrative of peaceful wanderers ignores that survival itself generates competition. Two groups encountering the same waterhole during drought won't resolve things through philosophical discussion. The stronger will claim it. The weaker will submit or die. This isn't corruption. It's mathematics. Rousseau says, you keep assuming scarcity that may not have existed. Early human populations were tiny relative to available resources. Most conflicts could be avoided through simple separation. Only when populations grew and territory became limited did systematic violence emerge. And even then, many societies developed elaborate customs to prevent escalation. Gift exchange, ritual combat with rules, intermarriage between groups. These weren't signs of your war of all against all, but evidence that cooperation was possible and preferred. Hobbes responds, preferred when convenient, abandoned when necessary. Your customs and rituals existed precisely because violence was always lurking beneath the surface, requiring constant management. The fact that societies develop mechanisms to contain conflict proves the conflict was fundamental. You don't need elaborate peace customs unless war is the natural alternative. These rituals were chains, just distributed differently than my sovereign's authority. But there's something both of you are missing. What does modern science actually reveal about human nature? Rousseau says, recent research on infant behavior is striking. Babies as young as 6 months show preferences for helpful individuals over harmful ones. They expect fair distribution of resources. They display empathy toward others in distress. None of this was taught. It appears spontaneously, suggesting moral intuitions are indeed natural. Just as I argued, humans possess innate compassion that precedes social conditioning. Hobbes responds, infant studies are grossly overinterpreted. Babies also display intense selfishness, demanding immediate gratification, showing no concern for others' needs when their own are unmet. They grab toys from other children. They scream when resources are denied. Yes, they show some prosocial tendencies, but these coexist with powerful selfish drives. This mixed nature supports my view that cooperation requires external enforcement, not your fantasy of natural goodness. Rousseau says, but the prosocial tendencies are there from the start. That's the crucial point. We're not born as purely selfish machines requiring civilization to impose morality. We arrive with capacities for empathy, fairness, and cooperation already present. Society's task is nurturing these natural capacities, not suppressing natural wickedness through force. When these tendencies are corrupted, It's because social arrangements reward selfishness over cooperation. Hobbes responds, capacity doesn't equal reliability. Humans also have natural capacities for violence, deception, and dominance. Under pressure, which tendencies prevail? When resources are scarce, when threats emerge, when fear rises, your gentle empathy vanishes while self-preservation intensifies. This isn't corruption. It's prioritization based on survival imperatives. My philosophy accounts for humans at their worst because that's when political systems face their greatest tests. Rousseau says, yet evolutionary biologists increasingly recognize that human success depended on cooperation, not just competition. Our ancestors survived by working together, sharing food, caring for sick members, raising children collectively. Groups with stronger cooperative bonds outcompeted groups of pure individualists. Natural selection favored social abilities. This means cooperation is as fundamental to human nature as self-interest, perhaps more so, since isolated individuals stood no chance of survival. Hobbes responds, cooperation within groups, yes. But notice what that required. Clear hierarchies determining who leads hunts, who receives which portions, who mates with whom, and cooperation within groups came paired with competition between groups. Your evolutionary argument proves my point. Humans cooperated to better compete against other humans. The cooperation was instrumental, serving ultimately selfish group interests. Remove the external threat, and internal conflicts re-emerge. Rousseau says, you're describing later developments, not original conditions. Small nomadic bands had minimal hierarchy and little intergroup competition because territories were vast and populations tiny. Complex hierarchies emerged with settled agriculture, stored surplus, and population density. These created new selection pressures favoring different traits. But for hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in conditions that rewarded egalitarian cooperation without requiring dominance hierarchies. Hobbes responds, speculation built on speculation. You have no evidence for this egalitarian paradise. Archaeological remains are fragmentary. Genetic studies show population bottlenecks suggesting periodic violence. Chimpanzees, our closest relatives, form hierarchies and conduct organized raids against neighboring groups. This suggests these tendencies predate humanity itself. Your noble savage never existed except in imagination. Rousseau says, but bonobos, equally close relatives, resolve conflicts through affection and sharing rather than violence. They live in female-dominated groups with minimal hierarchy. Which primate model we resemble depends partly on environmental conditions. Humans possess potential for both patterns. The question is, which social arrangements bring out which potentials? My argument is that many historical societies amplified our worst traits while suppressing our best. The scientific evidence refuses to clearly vindicate either philosopher. Humans emerge as creatures of profound contradiction. Hobbes says, which proves my point, given this contradictory nature, we cannot trust spontaneous goodness. We need systems that assume the worst and contain it. Better to have chains we don't need than to need chains we don't have. Your optimism about human nature is precisely what makes your political theory dangerous. It leaves societies unprepared for inevitable breakdowns in cooperation. Rousseau responds, and your pessimism creates self-fulfilling prophecies. Treat people as selfish brutes requiring chains, and they'll behave accordingly. Design institutions assuming corruption, and you'll get corruption. Create hierarchies of dominance, and you'll generate resentment and rebellion. The society you build reflects the assumptions you make about human nature. Choose different assumptions, design different institutions, and you'll see different outcomes. Hobbes says, naive beyond measure. The French Revolution, inspired by your ideas, descended into terror and dictatorship. Societies built on assumptions of human goodness collapse when reality intrudes. My realism may seem harsh, but it produces stable orders that actually protect people. Your idealism produces chaos, followed by tyranny, worse than anything I advocate. Rousseau responds, the revolution failed because it didn't go far enough in transforming institutions, not because it went too far. Halfway measures that proclaimed equality while preserving massive inequalities inevitably generated conflict. True implementation of the general will requires complete reconstruction of social relations, not merely replacing kings with assemblies while leaving property and privilege intact, Hobbes says, and there's your totalitarian impulse revealed. Complete reconstruction of social relations means destroying everything that exists and rebuilding according to your theory. This grants unlimited power to whoever claims to represent the general will. At least my sovereign's authority is honestly absolute. Yours claims democratic legitimacy while exercising equal or greater control over every aspect of life. Rousseau responds, false equivalence. My general will emerges from collective deliberation by free citizens. Your sovereign imposes will from above. The difference is everything. People obeying laws they made for themselves remain free. People obeying commands from absolute rulers are slaves, regardless of how much security those rulers provide. But here's what neither philosopher fully grasped. Human nature isn't fixed. It's responsive to conditions in ways more complex than either imagined. The debate has reached an impasse. Each philosopher can explain evidence supporting their view while dismissing evidence contradicting it. Each sees the other's political solution as prescription for disaster. One demands security through submission. The other promises freedom through participation. And both claim their path leads to human flourishing while the alternative guarantees misery. But there's still one question neither has adequately addressed. What actually happens when we try to implement these visions? History provides the laboratory. Hobbes's England descended into civil war. Brother fighting brother, entire towns destroyed. Rousseau's France exploded into revolution, then terror, then dictatorship. Both philosophers witnessed their theories tested against reality, and both could claim vindication while explaining away the failures. Hobbes says, observe what happens when sovereign authority collapses. The English Civil War demonstrated precisely what I predicted. Remove the common power keeping people in awe, and watch society fragment into armed factions. Neighbor turns against neighbor. Religious differences become pretexts for violence. Property becomes impossible to secure. Commerce halts. The weak suffer while the strong prey upon them. This wasn't philosophical speculation. This was observable reality proving my analysis correct. The Leviathan emerged from lived experience, not abstract theory. I watched my country tear itself apart because multiple claimants to sovereignty created the very condition I warned against. No clear ultimate authority meant perpetual conflict over who should rule. Parliament versus king. Presbyterian versus Anglican versus Catholic. Each faction believing themselves righteous while pursuing power through violence. My solution wasn't tyranny for its own sake. It was recognition that divided sovereignty produces endless war. Rousseau responds, and what produced that civil war? Centuries of accumulated inequality, religious oppression, and concentrated power that treated subjects as property. Your precious monarchs created the conditions for rebellion through their abuse of authority. The war didn't emerge from natural human wickedness, but from corrupted institutions that denied human dignity and freedom. You present the collapse as proof that humans need chains. I see it as proof that bad institutions eventually generate resistance. People don't naturally desire war. They're driven to it by systems that leave them no alternative for addressing legitimate grievances. Reform the institutions properly, and the violence becomes unnecessary. Hobbes says, romantic nonsense. The factions fought over who would rule, not whether anyone should rule. Even the most radical Republicans during the Commonwealth recognized the need for coercive authority. They simply wanted that authority in their own hands rather than the king's. Human nature revealed itself clearly. Given opportunity, people pursue power over others. The question isn't whether to have authority, but how to construct it to prevent endless conflict. My Leviathan proved more prophetic than I wished. The Commonwealth descended into military dictatorship under Cromwell, demonstrating that republican virtue doesn't prevent authoritarianism. It merely changes who holds the whip. The Restoration proved people preferred monarchical stability to republican chaos. They chose security over abstract liberty because humans are practical creatures who prioritize survival. Rousseau responds, the Commonwealth failed because it didn't transform property relations or eliminate fundamental inequalities. Cromwell's dictatorship emerged from attempting democratic reforms while preserving aristocratic privilege. Halfway measures produce the worst outcomes. True implementation of the general will require complete social reconstruction, not merely changing who sits on the throne. The French Revolution, whatever its excesses, demonstrated something profound about human possibility. People discovered they could overthrow centuries of oppression. They could declare universal rights. They could imagine society organized around liberty, equality, and fraternity rather than hereditary privilege and divine right. The terror represented failure to fully implement these principles, not their inherent flaw. Hobbes says, listen to yourself. Complete social reconstruction. This is precisely the totalitarian impulse I warned against. You grant unlimited power to whoever claims to represent the people's will, then act surprised when that power produces tyranny worse than any monarch. Robespierre sent thousands to the guillotine in the name of virtue. Napoleon crowned himself emperor with popular support. Your revolution devoured its children, then birthed a despot. The pattern repeats throughout history. Movements claiming to liberate humanity from oppression consistently produce new forms of domination. Why? Because human nature remains constant. Remove one hierarchy, and ambitious individuals construct another. Proclaim equality, and watch people scramble to distinguish themselves. Promise fraternity, and observe how quickly factions form. My realism protects against these predictable disasters by acknowledging what humans actually are, rather than what idealists wish them to be. Rousseau responds, false pattern recognition. You're comparing incomparable situations. The French Revolution faced external invasion, internal sabotage from displaced aristocrats, and the enormous challenge of transforming social relations developed over millennia. Revolutionary excess emerged from emergency conditions and incomplete transformation, not from the principles themselves. Consider the alternative history. What if reformers had gradually eliminated inequality, expanded participation, and transformed property relations peacefully? What if institutions had evolved to reflect the general will without violent rupture? The violence came from resistance to necessary change, not from change itself. Your Leviathan would preserve injustice indefinitely in the name of stability. Hobbes says, your hypothetical ignores everything about human behavior under pressure. Gradual reform requires those with power to voluntarily relinquish it. This never happens unless forced. You need coercive authority to implement even modest reforms. But once you grant that authority, it becomes self-perpetuating. The reformers become the new aristocracy. The cycle continues. Look at actual implementations of communal property and radical equality. They collapse into factionalism or require authoritarian enforcement. Humans are territorial, competitive, and concerned with relative status. These traits persist across all cultures and eras. Systems ignoring these facts don't change human nature. They fail spectacularly, while causing immense suffering. Rousseau responds, you're describing humans shaped by thousands of years of hierarchical, competitive social organization. This doesn't prove these traits are fixed in nature. It demonstrates how deeply institutions shape behavior. Your cynicism becomes self-fulfilling because people internalize the expectations of the systems they inhabit. Small-scale societies demonstrate alternatives exist. Anthropologists document cultures with minimal hierarchy, extensive sharing, and genuine egalitarian decision-making. These aren't utopias without conflict, but they prove humans can organize differently than your Leviathan imagines. The question isn't whether humans can be different, but what conditions support which possibilities. Hobbes says, cherry-picking small, isolated communities doesn't prove scalability. Egalitarian tribes work when everyone knows everyone. Resources are limited, and external threats force cooperation. Scale that to thousands or millions, introduce surplus worth competing over, and watch hierarchies emerge naturally. Every complex society in history develops stratification because organizing large numbers requires delegation of authority, which creates power differentials people exploit. Your noble savages lived in material poverty, with high infant mortality, and constant low-level warfare with neighboring groups. Hardly the paradise you imagine. They maintained equality partly because nobody had much worth stealing. Introduce prosperity and watch your egalitarian paradise fracture along lines of ambition and ability. Rousseau responds, so your solution is accepting permanent inequality as the price of prosperity. This is moral bankruptcy disguised as realism. Humans created prosperity through cooperation and innovation. We can certainly organize distribution more equitably than through hereditary privilege and exploitation. The small societies demonstrate principle, not blueprint. They prove humans possess capacity for alternatives. Scaling up requires different mechanisms, yes, but the same fundamental principle applies. Design institutions assuming and reinforcing human goodness rather than wickedness, and different behaviors emerge. Hobbes says, design institutions assuming goodness, and predators exploit those institutions. This isn't theory. It's observable in every naive social experiment throughout history. The commune that trusts everyone gets infiltrated by free riders. The society that assumes virtue gets dominated by the ruthless. You need mechanisms anticipating and containing human selfishness, or that selfishness devours everything. My Leviathan isn't pessimism, it's engineering. You don't build bridges assuming materials won't fail. You calculate for maximum stress and add safety margins. Similarly, you don't build societies assuming humans won't pursue self-interest at others' expense. You create systems that channel self-interest toward productive ends while preventing it from becoming destructive. Rousseau responds, except your engineering analogy fails completely. Bridges don't change behavior based on your assumptions about them. Humans do. Treat people as fundamentally selfish, and they'll behave selfishly because that's what your system rewards. Create institutions assuming cooperation and punishing free riding, and different norms emerge. Your Leviathan doesn't contain natural wickedness. It creates and perpetuates wickedness by structuring society around competition, hierarchy, and domination. Then you point at the resulting behavior as proof humans need your system. This is circular reasoning elevated to political philosophy. Hobbes says, if humans were as malleable as you claim, your revolutions would succeed instead of collapsing into terror. The fact that attempts to remake human nature consistently fail proves something essential resists your social engineering. That something is biology, evolutionary history, and the stubborn reality that we're animals with animal drives no amount of social reconstruction eliminates. The societies that thrive long-term are those that accept human nature rather than fighting it. Channel ambition through established procedures. Satisfy status-seeking through recognized hierarchies. Provide security that makes cooperation rational. This isn't oppression. It's practical wisdom about what actually works given what humans actually are. Rousseau responds, and those thriving societies you celebrate rest on foundations of exploitation that simply externalize costs. Colonial empires thrived by brutalizing conquered peoples. Industrial powers thrived by destroying workers' lives and communities. Your stability comes at the price of justice, and eventually that price becomes unbearable. The revolutions you dismiss as failures are actually proof that humans reject permanent injustice, whatever the cost. The real question isn't whether past attempts succeeded completely, but whether the alternative is acceptable. Your Leviathan demands we accept oppression as permanent, because liberation is difficult. This is counsel of despair, dressed as wisdom. I say humans deserve better and possess capacity to achieve it. Hobbes says the revolutions prove my point, not yours. They demonstrate that when humans attempt to transcend their nature and create utopian alternatives, they inevitably produce worse outcomes than the systems they replace. The French Revolution promised liberty, equality, and fraternity. It delivered the terror, mass executions, and eventually Napoleon's dictatorship. The Russian Revolution promised workers' paradise. It created Stalin's gulags and systematic starvation. Every attempt to remake society according to your principles follows the same trajectory. Initial euphoria, gradual disillusionment, increasing coercion to maintain the dream, and final collapse into something worse than the original system. This pattern isn't coincidence. It's what happens when you design institutions that ignore human nature. Your assumption that people will voluntarily sacrifice self-interest for collective good works briefly during revolutionary enthusiasm. But enthusiasm fades. Then you're left with institutions requiring sustained altruism from populations that don't possess it. The only way to maintain those institutions is force. So your paradise requires terror to function, which reveals it was never paradise at all. Rousseau responds, except you conveniently ignore the conditions under which those revolutions occurred. The French Revolution faced constant external invasion and internal sabotage from aristocrats and foreign powers desperate to prevent its success. The Russian Revolution emerged from World War I's devastation and immediately faced invasion by multiple nations. You're analyzing experiments conducted under maximum hostile pressure, then claiming their failures prove the concept itself is flawed. That's like pushing someone off a cliff and concluding humans can't fly. What those revolutions actually demonstrate is that transformation requires more than ideological commitment. It requires material conditions that support cooperation rather than desperation. When societies attempt radical change while surrounded by enemies and lacking resources, violence becomes necessary for survival, not because the principles are wrong. The terror didn't emerge from revolutionary ideals. It emerged from existential threats that would have destroyed any system, regardless of its founding principles. Hobbes says, so your defense is that true equality requires perfect conditions that never exist in reality. This proves my point more effectively than I could myself. Political philosophy must address the world as it actually is, not as we wish it were. Humans live in conditions of scarcity, competition, and mutual suspicion. They always have and always will. A political theory requiring ideal circumstances to function is useless precisely because those circumstances never obtain. My Leviathan works in the world that actually exists. It accepts human selfishness and channels it productively. It acknowledges that resources are limited and creates mechanisms for their distribution that minimize conflict. It recognizes that some humans are more capable than others and allows natural hierarchies to emerge while preventing them from becoming completely destructive. This isn't settling for oppression. It's recognizing constraints that no amount of wishful thinking eliminates. Your approach requires changing fundamental aspects of human psychology and social organization before your system can function. But you can't change those aspects because the institutions needed to change them can't exist until after the change has already occurred. You're trapped in circular reasoning with no practical path forward. Rousseau responds, and you're trapped in defeatist reasoning that guarantees continued injustice by declaring alternatives impossible. Yes, transformation requires favorable conditions, But humans create those conditions through collective action and institutional design. You claim my approach is circular, yet your Leviathan faces the same problem. How do selfish, suspicious individuals in your state of nature suddenly develop enough trust to create a sovereign? If everyone is purely self-interested, why would anyone believe others will honor the social contract? Your system requires the very cooperation you claim humans are incapable of sustaining without coercion. The difference is, I'm honest about the challenge, while you pretend your Leviathan solves it, when actually it just shifts the problem. Now you need people to trust the sovereign, obey laws, and maintain institutions. If humans are as selfish as you claim, those requirements are equally impossible. The truth is, both systems require some level of human cooperation and moral capacity. The question is whether we build institutions that cultivate and expand those capacities or institutions that suppress and corrupt them. Your Leviathan assumes the worst about humans and creates conditions where those assumptions become self-fulfilling. Mine assumes potential for better and creates conditions where that potential can develop. Hobbes says, the sovereign solves the cooperation problem precisely because it removes trust from the equation. Individuals don't need to trust each other. They only need to fear punishment from an authority powerful enough to enforce compliance. This is achievable because humans naturally fear death and pain. You don't need to change human nature. You just need sufficient force to make cooperation rational for self-interested individuals. The genius of my system is that it works with human nature rather than against it. Selfish people obey laws not from virtue, but from calculation that disobedience costs more than compliance. This calculation remains stable across different circumstances and populations. Your system requires transforming selfish people into virtuous ones, which requires conditions that selfish people won't create in the first place. You dismiss this as defeatism. I call it realism. The societies that have endured for centuries are those that accepted human limitations and worked within them. Rome lasted 1,000 years by organizing selfish ambition through established procedures. The British Empire dominated the globe by channeling competitive energy into commercial expansion. Modern democracies maintain order by making self-interest serve collective stability through elections and markets. Show me one society based on your principles that has endured multiple generations without collapsing into either chaos or tyranny. You can't, because none exist. This isn't coincidence. It's evidence that your model contradicts something essential about how humans actually function in groups over time. Rousseau responds, Rome collapsed into civil war repeatedly and finally disintegrated completely. The British Empire was built on slavery, colonialism, and exploitation that eventually became unsustainable. Modern democracies face escalating inequality, environmental destruction, and political dysfunction. These are your examples of successful systems. They're actually evidence that organizing society around selfishness and competition produces temporary stability purchased at tremendous human cost, then eventually fails anyway. You want examples of cooperative societies? Look at indigenous communities that sustained themselves for millennia before European contact. Look at worker cooperatives that outperform traditional corporations in member satisfaction and often productivity. Look at communities that rallied during crises, sharing resources, and supporting each other without coercion. These examples exist everywhere if you're willing to see them. The reason you can't find large-scale examples matching your criteria is that powerful interests have systematically destroyed alternatives. When cooperative communities emerge, they get crushed by military force, economic pressure, or internal sabotage from those who profit from inequality. Then people like you point at their destruction as proof they couldn't work, ignoring that they were deliberately destroyed by those threatened by their success. Hobbes says, if these alternatives were truly superior, they would outcompete the systems you claim are failing. The fact that they get crushed proves they're weaker, which proves they're worse adapted to reality as it actually exists. You're essentially arguing that your preferred systems would work perfectly if only the world were completely different. But the world isn't different, and political philosophy must address the world that exists. Your indigenous communities worked at small scale with minimal surplus and no significant technological development. The moment populations grew and resources became valuable enough to fight over, those systems broke down. Your worker cooperatives exist as tiny experiments within larger market economies that provide their infrastructure and constrain their behavior. Remove that larger system and they'd collapse immediately. The crises where communities cooperate spontaneously are temporary. People rally during earthquakes or floods because they recognize immediate shared threats. But that cooperation evaporates once the crisis passes and normal competition resumes. You're extrapolating from emergency conditions to claim humans can sustain cooperation permanently, which is like claiming humans can hold their breath indefinitely because they can do it for 30 seconds. Rousseau responds, so your position is that might makes right? Systems that crush alternatives are therefore superior. This is moral nihilism disguised as practical wisdom. By your logic, every successful tyranny proves tyranny works and should be embraced. Every powerful predator proves predation is optimal. You've abandoned any pretense of ethical reasoning in favor of pure power worship. The indigenous societies you dismiss as primitive often achieved remarkable quality of life without the violence, inequality, and environmental destruction your civilizations produce. They didn't develop your technology because they didn't need it. They met human needs through cooperation and sustainable practices. That you consider this failure rather than success reveals how completely your worldview is captured by assumptions about progress and domination. And yes, cooperation intensifies during crises because crises make shared interests obvious. But shared interests exist constantly. We all benefit from clean air, stable climate, and peaceful communities. The fact that your systems obscure these shared interests through competition and artificial scarcity doesn't mean they're not real. It means your systems are poorly designed. Hobbes says, quality of life without technology means short lifespans, high infant mortality, and vulnerability to disease and famine. Your romanticization of indigenous societies ignores the harsh realities they faced. They cooperated because they had to, not because they were morally superior. The moment conditions changed and cooperation became less necessary or less beneficial, those societies developed hierarchy and conflict, just like every other human community. You claim shared interests exist constantly, but they don't override individual interests in most circumstances. Yes, everyone benefits from clean air generally, but specific individuals benefit more from polluting activities that serve their immediate interests. Without mechanisms forcing them to internalize costs, they'll pollute. This isn't moral failure, it's rational calculation given the incentive structure. Your solution requires changing incentives through institutions that assume and reward cooperation. But those institutions can only emerge if people already cooperate enough to create them. You're back to the circular problem. My Leviathan breaks that circle by introducing force sufficient to make cooperation rational for selfish actors. It's not pretty, but it works. Rousseau responds, it works for whom? The powerful who benefit from current arrangements certainly find your system satisfactory. But millions suffering under inequality, exploitation, and environmental destruction might disagree. Your philosophy provides intellectual cover for their oppression by declaring it inevitable and necessary. This is perhaps the most dangerous aspect of your thought. You don't just accept injustice, you sanctify it. Human nature is not fixed. It's shaped by institutions and experiences. Create institutions rewarding selfishness, and you get selfish behavior. Create institutions rewarding cooperation, and you get cooperative behavior. The question isn't whether humans are naturally one or the other. It's what kind of humans we want to become and what kind of world we want to build. You've chosen selfishness and domination. I choose cooperation and flourishing. Hobbes says, you accuse me of sanctifying injustice, But you're the one who offers no practical path to your imagined paradise. You speak of creating institutions that reward cooperation, as if institutions spring fully formed from good intentions. They don't. Every functional institution in history emerged from struggle, compromise, and the gradual accumulation of power sufficient to enforce agreed rules. Your vision requires people to cooperate in building cooperative systems before those systems exist. Mine acknowledges that cooperation only becomes sustainable after power establishes order. You claim human nature is shaped by institutions. Fine. But who shapes the first institutions? And how do they maintain them against those who would exploit cooperation for personal gain? You need enforcers. You need hierarchy. You need mechanisms that don't rely on everyone spontaneously choosing cooperation. The moment you admit this, you've conceded my central point. Order precedes cooperation, not the other way around. The millions suffering under inequality you mention suffer less than they would in the chaos preceding stable governance. Yes, systems are imperfect. Yes, power corrupts. But the alternative isn't your cooperative utopia. It's the war of all against all, where suffering is universal rather than concentrated. You offer them dreams. I offer them survival. Rousseau responds, survival isn't enough. Humans don't just want to live. They want to live well, with dignity, purpose, and connection. Your Leviathan provides physical security at the cost of everything that makes life worth living. You've reduced human existence to mere biological continuation, stripped of the qualities that define our humanity. And no, order doesn't precede cooperation. They emerge together through mutual recognition of shared interests. Small communities throughout history have organized themselves cooperatively without first establishing dominating powers. They created norms through dialogue, enforced them through social pressure, and adjusted them as circumstances changed. This process is messy and imperfect, but it produces legitimate authority rather than imposed control. Your enforcers and hierarchy become unnecessary when people understand that cooperation serves their genuine interests better than competition. Yes, this requires education, institutional support, and cultural development. But these aren't impossible prerequisites. They're achievable goals that societies can work toward once they reject the false necessity of domination. The suffering you dismiss as necessary is only necessary within systems designed around your assumptions. Change the assumptions, and different systems become possible. Systems where inequality isn't tolerated because everyone recognizes how it undermines collective well-being. Where cooperation is reinforced because institutions reward it rather than punishing it. Hobbes says, your small cooperative communities worked only under specific conditions that no longer exist. They required isolation, limited population, shared culture, and absence of external threats. The moment any of these conditions changed, cooperation broke down or transformed into hierarchy. This isn't speculation, it's documented history. Modern societies face complexity your village model can't address. Millions of people with diverse interests, values, and backgrounds must coordinate across vast distances. Markets require standardized rules. Technology creates power asymmetries. Resources are unevenly distributed. Your approach offers no solutions to these realities beyond vague appeals to changing assumptions and building better institutions. I'm not reducing humans to biological machines by acknowledging our material nature. I'm accepting reality as it exists, rather than as we wish it were. Humans are physical beings with physical needs operating according to natural laws. Our thoughts, emotions, and choices emerge from these physical processes. Understanding this doesn't diminish human dignity. It provides the foundation for realistic social organization. Your emphasis on dignity, purpose, and connection is beautiful rhetoric that collapses under scrutiny. Dignity requires security. Purpose requires stability. Connection requires trust, which requires enforcement mechanisms preventing betrayal. Every value you celebrate depends on the order I describe. You want the fruits of Leviathan while pretending you can grow them in cooperative gardens. Rousseau responds, those supposedly specific conditions that allowed cooperation aren't anomalies. They're the normal state of human social organization throughout most of our species' history. What's anomalous is the massive inequality, concentrated power, and environmental destruction your systems produce. You've normalized the abnormal and dismissed the normal as unrealistic. Modern complexity doesn't require domination. It requires coordination, which cooperation can provide more effectively than hierarchy. Decentralized networks coordinate millions of people daily without centralized control. Open source projects create sophisticated technology through voluntary collaboration. Communities worldwide manage common resources sustainably through negotiated agreements rather than imposed rules. These examples prove that alternatives to your model already exist and function. They're not utopian fantasies. They're working realities that demonstrate cooperation scales far better than you admit. The question isn't whether cooperation can handle complexity. It's why we tolerate systems that concentrate power and produce inequality when alternatives are available. Your claim that my values depend on your order reverses causation. Order emerges from shared values, not the other way around. People create stability by committing to mutual respect and collective well-being. They develop trust through repeated positive interactions, not through fear of punishment. The enforcement mechanisms you consider necessary are symptoms of systems that have already failed to cultivate genuine cooperation. And your materialist view of human nature isn't acceptance of reality. It's a choice to focus on certain aspects of human experience while ignoring others. Yes, we're physical beings, but we're also meaning-making beings who create culture, art, philosophy, and love. These aren't mere byproducts of physical processes. They're constitutive features of human life that your framework systematically undervalues. Hobbes says, your modern examples of cooperation succeed precisely because they operate within larger systems, providing the order they require. Open source projects rely on legal frameworks protecting intellectual property and contract enforcement. Decentralized networks depend on infrastructure built and maintained through hierarchical organizations. Community resource management works where governments provide backup enforcement and resolve disputes. Strip away these supporting structures and watch your cooperative examples collapse. They're parasitic on the order they claim to transcend. This doesn't make them worthless, but it proves they can't replace the foundational systems ensuring basic security and property rights. You romanticize meaning-making and culture as though they exist independently of material conditions. They don't. Art requires leisure time, which requires economic surplus, which requires productive organization. Philosophy requires education, which requires stable institutions. Love requires security, sufficient to form lasting bonds. Every higher human achievement rests on the material foundation of organized society. Your accusation that I undervalue these achievements misunderstands my position entirely. I value them tremendously, which is exactly why I insist on maintaining the conditions that make them possible. You risk those conditions by promoting cooperative fantasies that can't sustain themselves once tested by real human behavior under pressure. The choice isn't between my grim order and your joyful cooperation. It's between sustainable order that enables human flourishing despite our flaws, and unsustainable idealism that collapses when reality intrudes. I choose the former. You choose comforting illusions. Rousseau responds, everything you just described as requiring hierarchy can be achieved cooperatively. Legal frameworks emerge from communities negotiating shared standards. Infrastructure gets built by people working together toward common goals. Education happens when knowledge is shared freely rather than controlled for profit. None of these require domination. Your insistence that cooperation depends on underlying order created by force reveals your inability to imagine alternatives to the systems you've internalized. You see hierarchy everywhere because you assume it's necessary, then interpret every cooperative success as secretly dependent on hierarchy. This is circular reasoning masquerading as realism. The material conditions enabling art, philosophy, and love don't require your Leviathan. They require social organization, which cooperation provides more humanely and sustainably than domination. Indigenous societies created rich cultural traditions without developing your hierarchies. Medieval guilds produced magnificent craftsmanship through cooperative structures. Modern cooperatives generate economic value while distributing benefits equitably. These aren't exceptions proving your rule. They're alternatives you refuse to acknowledge because they contradict your worldview. You've mistaken one possible form of social organization for the only possible form. This failure of imagination is your fundamental error, and I don't promote fantasies. I promote possibilities supported by evidence you consistently ignore. The question facing anyone listening to this debate isn't which philosophy is more realistic. It's which philosophy creates the reality we want to inhabit. Do we accept selfishness and domination as inevitable, building systems that reinforce them? Or do we recognize our capacity for cooperation and mutual aid, building systems that nurture them? Hobbes says, the indigenous societies and medieval guilds you cite either disappeared or transformed into hierarchical systems when faced with competition from more organized rivals. This isn't coincidence. It's selection pressure favoring more effective organizational forms. Your alternatives didn't fail because people stopped believing in them. They failed because they couldn't compete with systems built on principles I describe. This is the brutal reality you refuse to accept. Good intentions don't defeat superior organization. Cooperative feelings don't outproduce coordinated effort backed by enforcement. Noble values don't protect communities from those willing to use force strategically. I'm not choosing the reality I want. I'm describing the reality that exists regardless of our preferences. Your question about which philosophy creates the reality we want to inhabit presumes we have that choice. We don't. Reality constrains our options. Human nature limits possible social arrangements. Historical patterns reveal which systems survive and which collapse. Ignoring these constraints doesn't make them disappear. It just ensures failure when idealism meets fact. So yes, I accept selfishness and competition as fundamental features of human behavior, requiring management through institutions that don't assume universal cooperation. You can call this pessimistic. I call it honest. And honesty about human nature is the only foundation for building systems that actually work, rather than systems that sound appealing in philosophical debates. Rousseau says, perhaps that's where we differ most fundamentally. You believe reality is fixed, and we must adapt to it. I believe reality is what we make it through our choices and actions. Neither of us can prove the other wrong, because we're arguing about possibilities, not certainties. But the consequences of accepting your view versus mine couldn't be more different. Your philosophy perpetuates the very conditions it claims are inevitable. Mine opens space for transformation you insist is impossible. History will judge which approach served humanity better. The voices fade as sleep deepens, but the question they've debated remains suspended in the space between waking and dreaming. Are humans naturally good or naturally selfish? The answer shapes everything. How you vote, how you parent, whether you see strangers as threats or potential allies, whether you believe change is possible or futile. Modern science suggests both philosophers grasp partial truths. We're neither Hobbes's pure machines nor Rousseau's noble savages. We're creatures capable of remarkable cooperation and terrible cruelty, often simultaneously. Infants display both empathy and selfishness. Evolution favored both competition and collaboration. Our nature contains multitudes that different circumstances call forth. But here's what matters more than which philosopher was right. the assumptions you accept about human nature become self-fulfilling. Societies built on Hobbesian principles, assuming selfishness and requiring control, tend to produce selfish, controlled people. Those built on trust and cooperation tend to foster those qualities. Not perfectly, not universally, but enough that the choice between philosophies becomes a choice between futures. You'll face this choice tomorrow when you interact with others. Will you assume they're fundamentally like you, capable of goodness when circumstances permit? Or will you assume they're threats requiring management and control? Your answer ripples outward, shaping not just your experience, but the world you help create. The debate between Hobbes and Rousseau never ends because it's not really about what humans are. It's about what we're becoming. Every interaction, every institution, every choice about how to organize our lives together moves us incrementally toward one vision or the other. The philosophers offered their arguments. Now you must decide which world you'll help build.